Hello, today is May 12th, 2021, and thank you for joining me for another edition of the Market Commentator Podcast. My name is Andy Willms, and I am President and CEO of the Milwaukee Company. Joining me this morning is my son, Jake Willms, who is a quantitative analyst with the Milwaukee Company. Today, Jake and I will be discussing why it's a great time to convert a traditional IRA into a Roth IRA and the arguments for and against increasing the minimum wage to $15 an hour. Before we get started, please keep in mind that this podcast is for informational purposes only and that the views expressed in today's podcast are Jake and my personal views and not necessarily those of the Milwaukee Company. Jake, thank you for joining me this morning.
Yeah, thank you for having me on the show. I appreciate it as always. Let's begin with a quick reminder of what exactly is a Roth IRA.
Sure. Generally speaking, as you know, Jake, retirement plans and IRAs are funded with pre-tax earnings, and distributions are treated as taxable income. With the Roth IRA, that is sort of reversed. Contributions are included in income when made, and then distributions from the Roth IRA, or in some cases, it might be a Roth 401k. In either case, the distributions are tax-free. So as a result, the earnings and gains of a traditional retirement account and IRAs are included in taxable income, but with a Roth IRA or a Roth 401k, they are tax-free. A Roth IRA is often a better way to save for retirement for someone who can afford to make the maximum contribution to the Roth IRA, unless he or she expects their income to be taxed at lower rates after he or she retires.
Okay, that makes sense. Why do you think then so many people would choose a traditional IRA as opposed to the Roth version?
Well, I mean, up until this point, I think that's happened because many people feel like deferring taxes is a good thing. And the old saying was a tax deferred is a tax saved. And they plan to take distributions in retirement where they think they're going to be in a lower tax bracket. But as it turns out, that may not be the case. And so for sometimes that premise proves to be incorrect, especially if tax rates go up between the time you made the contribution and the time you start withdrawals.
Okay. Do you know, can anybody just become an Roth IRA? Do you have to meet a certain criteria or?
Well, anybody can contribute to it, but it, of course, must be made, all contributions must be made from earned income. And there are limits on how much earned income you can have and still make a Roth IRA contribution. For 2021, if you're married and filing jointly, both you and your spouse can make a $6,000 contribution to a Roth IRA if you have adjusted income under $198,000. If you're single, that amount is a bit lower. You can only make the contribution full contribution if your income is under $125,000. And the contributions limits drop if you earn more than these amounts. And you can't contribute anything at all if you're lucky enough to earn more than $208,000 as a married couple or $140,000 as a single person.
So what does that mean then? If let's say you're a married couple and you're making over 208,000, can you not participate in the Roth IRA at all, and you have to do a traditional instead?
You cannot contribute to the Roth IRAs once your income exceeds that amount, but you can convert a traditional IRA to a Roth IRA at any income level. That used to be capped. It used to be limits on who could convert, but that limit has been no longer in part of the Internal Revenue Code.
Okay. Now, so you just talked about converting. What does that mean when you do a Roth IRA conversion?
That's when the owner of an IRA elects to convert part or all of the traditional retirement account or IRA to a Roth IRA.
So does that mean that do they have any consequences to that? Any costs associated with it?
Well, if you take what was the IRA that was funded with tax-free contributions and you convert it to a Roth IRA, which can only be made with after-tax contributions, that conversion results in tax. The money that's being converted is included in income. So you have to be very careful that the conversion doesn't push you into much higher tax bracket than you would have otherwise have been in. And but you can avoid that by maybe only converting part of the IRA to a Roth IRA rather than the whole thing.
Okay, so then I feel like I got a good understanding of how Roth IRAs work, but why now is a good time to convert?
Well, I think it's an excellent. I've always, encouraged clients to give serious thought to Roth IRA conversions. Generally speaking, I think it's a good idea for most people. Not everybody, but for a large percentage of people, I think it's a good idea. And especially so now that Congress is looking to raise income taxes. High income earners are looking at paying much higher taxes for a much longer period of time. If tax rates do in fact go up, and then even if your income goes down, you might still be paying higher tax rates after you retire than you did beforehand, depending on how the tax hikes are constructed. Now, it's true that the White House is currently proposing, limiting the tax hikes to individuals who make over $400,000. But we could see that threshold being lowered down the road, given the growing influence of the more progressive members of Congress, and as I should say, as a result of the massive increases in the federal deficit.
All right, that makes sense.
Uh,
I think
oh,
that covers all my questions I had about IRAs.
well, I just want to let me just mention to people that there are other advantages that are to doing the conversion. One thing is that the Roth IRA is not subject to minimum distributions. When you turn 70 and a half, you normally have to take required minimum distributions from your traditional IRA. You don't have to do that with a Roth, so the money can compound and grow at a longer time, which means the beneficiaries, your kids or whoever, are going to have the potential to inherit more. And another thing to keep in mind is that the inherited IRA can be withdrawn over the beneficiary over a 10-year period, which allows the benefit after the account owner dies, I should say. So that allows the beneficiary to continue to get that tax-free growth in the inherited IRA for quite a number of years after the account owner dies. And it could also mean that the beneficiary is paying lower taxes because the distribution won't be counted. If it's a Roth distribution, that distribution is not counted when determining what tax bracket the beneficiary is in. Whereas if it's a traditional IRA, they have to include that money and income when it's received. So there's a lot of reasons to consider it, even at any time, but especially now where we're looking at higher income taxes and higher estate taxes. I should mention that quickly too, because there's a talk about reducing the amount of money you can give away tax-free at death, and talk about raising the tax rates on the amount that is taxable, and so on and so forth. And when you have an IRA, the value of the IRA is subject to estate, or is included, I should say, in your taxable estate, that full dollar amount, right? Even though a big hunk of that is taxable, and so a big hunk of it's going to pay income taxes. So heirs end up paying estate taxes on money that's ultimately going to go to be used to pay income taxes. It's a double whammy if your estate's a taxable estate. But if you converted it to a Roth IRA and you pay the income taxes during your lifetime, then that money's already out of the estate, right? So you can't it's not subject to estate taxes. So you, in essence, can reduce the size of your taxable estate by paying the income taxes on your IRA account before you die. Okay, but with that being said, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about efforts to raise the minimum wage. What's up with that, Jake?
Yeah, this is a really interesting topic that's kind of gained some momentum recently. I got interested in it when I heard a couple of days ago that multiple McDonald's locations across 15 major cities in the U.S. are planning a strike on May 19th. They're demanding a minimum wage increase to $15, and they're trying to put pressure on the May 20th annual meeting for McDonald's by doing it the day before. So I think
So it's
that
the employees at those McDonald's that are going on strike.
right, yeah, the cooks and the cashiers and the like.
Yep.
And it's just kind of bringing forth a very common question over the last couple of years about the pros and cons of increasing the federal minimum wage from about $7.25 to $15. It's a pretty substantial increase. So I want to
More
try
than
to,
double.
yeah, I want to try to bring some clarity on maybe why or why not this isn't a good idea.
Well, it is a large increase. I mean, like I said, more than double. But then again, it hasn't been increased for a very long time. So that you got to keep that in mind too when you evaluate the amount of the increase. But anyway, what are the pros and cons of doing it in your mind?
I would say that the proponents are arguing that the increase in minimum wage is going to lead to the substantial decline in household and child poverty. They're arguing it's a net benefit. They have support from locations such as the Congressional Budget Office. They revealed a report that if the federal minimum wage increased to $15 gradually by 2025, 27 million workers would be lifted and be benefited, I should say, and 900,000 of those would be lifted out of poverty who are currently in poverty. However, at a cost, they speculate that the deficit would increase by $54 billion and 1.4 million jobs would be lost over the 4 year span. This kind of sums up generally the discussion, in my view. It's an argument over if quantity is better than quality, because as we all know, markets will efficiently solve this problem if wages are doubling at the bottom
Right.
end.
Right.
And it's reasonable to assume that the lower income jobs will be harder to find because there's not going to be that much wage revenue to go around, or wage budget, I should say, to go around. Goldman
Yeah.
Sachs analysts recently estimated that a federal minimum wage rise to $15 an hour would impact 30% of workers in the US. So, a similar number, I think, to what the CBO came up with, most of which, by the way, have household incomes below $50,000.
Well, Jake, let me ask you a question. So I understand you mentioned McDonald's is going to kind of, is looking at getting some pushback on this, but a lot of big employers have already done this, like Walmart and so on and so forth.
Target,
You
yeah,
know,
I think Target's done it as
Target,
well.
a lot of bigger retailers can do this. I guess the one thing I worry a little bit about. I mean, we all want to see, poverty reduced and, especially child poverty, all that kind of thing, which I do think raising the minimum wage can help very significantly. But I do also am concerned about the small business owners. They're the ones that are going to have the most struggle with this. Like the little Ace Hardware here in Grafton, Wisconsin, where Michael worked. Your brother Michael worked for so long and made minimum wage, and they were able to, hire all these high school kids to work there because they can pay them much less than they would pay, someone who was older because of the minimum wage being so low. So it's really great on its face, and it sounds so wonderful, but I think we do have to be a little bit cautious about the possible drawbacks. I mean, and not to sound like a Scrooge, but you also have to think about the fact that if it costs businesses more to hire people, they'll hire fewer workers and invest more in labor saving technologies.
Yeah, I actually think I think that's a benefit. I would love to see businesses push more towards labor saving technology and efficiency because I think that's the future. I
But
don't if you think about like McDonald's, we're going to keep using that example. I much prefer to use the screen where I can pick my order and put it in swipe, and I don't have to wait in the line as much. I don't have to explain it to somebody else or risk them
well,
getting the order wrong.
well, I get that. I get that, but you might not like it as much if you were the person who used to take the order,
Yeah,
right?
that's true.
And
And it's
and a lot of this will impact young people who are getting their first jobs. And as you well know, I very much favor young people having working and having jobs and getting that good work experience. So if we make the minimum wage too high and therefore businesses turn to technology, McDonald's has done a lot of that, as you point out. I'm just afraid that people who are either younger and getting their first job, or people whose work skills are limited and will find themselves out of work altogether, which will mean now some people argue then you solve that by having a guaranteed income, universal income for everybody, but then that raises a whole bunch of problems too.
Yeah,
But
I do think that this sort of topic is trending towards that reality as technology tends to optimize out some of these old jobs. I think it's something that is going to keep on being brought up over time. This
Yeah.
is just another example about how efficiency is driving down the quantity of available workers. And even in a case where you're pushing for something that's a net benefit and has been proven to be a net benefit by the CBO, it still results in a lot of people losing work. And that's just an eventuality of this, in my view. I personally think that it's a net benefit. I agree with them. I would like to see it raised because I think it's been a long overdue. But I do feel bad for those that get hurt by this because there will be families and people that are hurt by this, even if the goal is to help everyone.
Yeah, this tends to be one of those things where there's winners and losers, and
Yeah.
I think a lot of people have the same goals, uh, what they'd like to see the ultimate results be, but a considerable difference of opinion on how best to get there. So
Yeah. As long as it's done in a staged way, I don't think it should jump immediately to 15 today. I think it has to be done gradually to help businesses adjust and prepare. Also, in a way that's equitable for everybody. I don't think that hike's going to cause major problems. I
mhm.
think it will be mainly a benefit for low income workers, and the increased wage growth should also increase demand for the jobs, which should increase competition for the jobs. And hopefully, that increased competition will pass on in quality to the consumers.
Well, we'll see. Time will tell. I sure hope you're right. I guess I would argue too, another potential benefit is if minimum wage goes up, there's more money for people to spend, which would be, support the growing economy as well. So it's one that I don't think there's any right answer to know exactly how it's going to happen. I think it's probably is going to happen. So we will be able to learn and watch and see how it all plays out. Well, I guess that'll wrap it up for us today, Jake. Thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, of course, anytime.
And thank you to our listeners. And I want to remind you, listeners, to please keep in mind you should conduct your own independent research for acting on any of the information or opinions expressed during this podcast. And you should not act on anything you've heard in this podcast until you have discussed it with qualified financial professionals who are familiar with your personal situation and investment objectives. Thanks again, and have a great day.
This podcast is for general informational purposes only and is not intended to be a solicitation, offering, or recommendation of any security, commodity, derivative, investment management service, or advisory service. Nothing in this podcast constitutes or should be understood as constituting a recommendation to enter in any securities transactions or to engage in any of the investment strategies discussed. Viewers should consult with an independent financial professional or independently research and verify information presented in this podcast before acting on it.